Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins that I want to check in on, and they're the yellow buckets that you see down here. Those systems are now only 9 days old. They're the newest of my systems. They're running European night crawlers. All the worms that occupy those three systems lived in a single tub, which ended its composting life cycles 9 days ago. So these little guys have been separated from their old environment for 9 days. The environment they were given as a replacement to live in was only bedding, strictly bedding. I didn't put any food into the bin. Sometimes I pre-build some of my new worm systems with some food tucked away in there for the worms to stumble on and feed on after they move in. In this case, I had built the systems with bedding only, but I knew that I was bringing the worms over with a good amount of leftover food that was part of the baiting station that I had created to lure the worms out of their finished compost in the previous tub that they lived in. So each of those bins probably has a banana peel or some sort of leftover from the old system that they got moved over from. But I thought they were due for a check-in, if nothing more. But I've also got a little bit of food to give them. It's a number of different food scraps, different bits of, what do we got here? There's some carrot and all kinds of different bits of vegetable that had been frozen up until yesterday. My aim was to feed these guys yesterday, so this stuff was taken out of the freezer to let it thaw. And then it just ended up back in the refrigerator overnight so that it wouldn't get really disgusting. But it's time to give it to the worms. I'm going to get those buckets up here onto the bench one at a time, and we'll give each one a portion of this food. Besides the stuff that had been frozen, I've also got coffee here. I guess the benefit of needing to wait one extra day for these little guys is that they get a whole extra day's worth of coffee here. And a lemon that never even made it into the freezer. So I usually use a tripod to hold my camera, but you can probably tell this is a handheld shot. And then once we get down into the buckets, I'm going to be using this crazy rig that I can use to clip onto the side of the bucket wall and then suspend the camera that'll be attached on the opposite end down into the bin. Last time I used it, I felt like I was too close and the stuff was blurry, out of focus. So I think I'm going to reduce the length of this extension thing here. So we're going to give this a try and see what type of footage we end up with. So let's get to work. As you can see, bucket number one is here on the bench, but I've got my customary label that needs to go onto the system. So before we get to feeding and tending to the system, let's get this thing set up with its label. So these labels were already set to go and could have been put on the day that the worms were released into their new home, but I opted to just hold off for whatever reason. I don't know why. And at this point, it's just high time to get these things labeled in the traditional way. Kind of makes it official. And then I also get to use the label to cover up the name of the manufacturer of the product that was in this container, so I don't have to give them any free advertising. Alright, so let's get clipped in and get to work. Well, this is a little bit awkward. First of all, I've got this shadow cast down into the bin by the camera itself. Then by the time I get my hands down in here to try to get any work done, it's a wonder any light is getting in here at all. So now I've got a pretty good moisture level going on in here. Now the only thing that I did do in these systems since I launched them was that I did pop in here once or twice and with my spray bottle just to make sure that this top covering piece of paper was soaking wet. I wanted to make sure that the moisture level in here was good, and one of the ideas I had for managing that was to maybe put a piece of plastic over the top. Obviously, that's not the way I played it here. There was no plastic covering, there was only the paper and the cardboard, and it did seem to do a pretty decent job holding the moisture in. Everything feels good. Yeah, everything feels just right. And I wonder if it just might have something to do with the depth of the system. You know, maybe the dry air just doesn't whisk away the moist air coming off this in the form of evaporation as easily as in my shallower systems. But I'm glad to see that the moisture level is held up good in here. We're already starting to bump into a couple of the worms. And here too, I'm trying to keep my head out of the light source, because if I bring my head in to get a good look down into the system, I create another wicked shadow in here. So I don't know if we're going to win any Academy Awards for the footage that we create when we're checking in on these bucket systems, but we'll do our best to make it interesting, even though it might not be a cinematic wonder. So like I said, there's really no food in here yet. Nothing's been placed in here, but you might have caught a glimpse of some of the stuff that came over with the worms. This is I thought I saw some stuff that was leftover foods. I thought I saw some banana peel. I kind of lost track of it. I started opening up a hole that we could place today's feeding into. I really wanted to build up the volume of these systems significantly, because as you can see right now, well, actually, you know what? I went down a little bit further, and I'm finding this to be a little bit deeper than I could tell. I think I'm kind of at a loss. Oh, here's the number 1 that we used to launch the bin with. The worms were placed on top of a little slip of paper that had the number of their bin written on it. But what was I saying? So I wanted to not only put food in here, but a lot of bedding, so that we can, you know, gradually over the course of numerous feedings, each time adding more and more material to give these worms a lot of space to cruise around in, possibly, you know, triggering a response within them that says, hey, we've got plenty of room here, we can expand our population, so let's do that. So that's kind of what I want to see these worms arrive at once they sense that they've got plenty of bedding to zip around in. Alright, this isn't so bad. If this hits the camera, it just falls right off. It's all that thawed out veggie matter and coffee that I got to be careful with placing it in here, so I don't end up covering my camera with it. So let's start into that here carefully. The coffee I bought down here is intended for 3 systems, so we'll put some in and then we'll share with the others. Let's throw a little bit of paper in here with this coffee. One of my things lately has been to try to help the coffee that I feed in my systems break down more easily by combining it with neighboring materials. So I don't know if it really works or not, but it's just an attempt to see if I can help the coffee get a little bit more attention than it does when it's just a big clump, you know. It just seems like when something's a big clump, it goes nowhere fast. So the next thing to go in is going to be, well, let's start out with 1 handful and see how much of a dent we put into the food supply here. Again, I'm trying to divvy this out in a way that it can be spread out evenly among 3 systems, just kind of based on the assumption that hopefully these systems have roughly the same number of worms in them. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of pulverized eggshell down onto the food I'm giving them. Since it's a little bit clumsy reaching down in there, I might have given them a little bit more than I normally would, but what the heck. So now on top of that, I'm going to go in with another ingredient that probably doesn't have much potential of harming the camera, so I don't have to worry so much about steering clear of the camera. But this is also just more bedding material for them. So I guess combined with the shredded paper and the leaves, hopefully they'll have some stuff that they can enjoy zipping around in. I usually rely on the moisture content brought in by the foods that I provide, as well as the existing moisture in the system to hydrate some of the drier materials I feed with. So I think we're going to, there's another damp item, a whole bunch of lemon juice inside that lemon. So I'm not going to dampen anything here. I usually hold off the dampening process. I usually get my squirt gun out only when I feel like it's necessary. I don't want it to be a routine part of every feeding. To me, it's more of a adjuster to something that might be a little bit off kilter or out of whack. So I'm not going to adopt the spraying down of the system as a routine thing to include in all the feedings. For that matter, the inclusion of grit is also kind of an optional thing that I don't necessarily do every time either. So I think between the shredded paper and leaves that we put in here, we've given them a nice generous portion of bedding. The grit was also pretty generous, and I think the food at this point Turned out to be a little bit more than I expected. It didn't look like that much when it was sitting in that tray over there, and then I guess combined with 2/3 of a coffee filter full of coffee, it did amount to a pretty decent size feeding. So we got a little peek down the middle, and we didn't see much action. But the next time we come in here, since the food is now centered in the bin and is in a very distinct spot now, maybe we'll see a little bit more activity, or maybe a little bit more mobbing. But then again, these are European night crawlers. They don't have that kind of mobbing tendency like you see in some other worms like red wigglers. So we might come back here and find worms hanging out, but they seem to keep their distance. I don't see any worms yet. I think my estimate for how many worms went in here was just sort of a calculated number of 1/3 of what was thought to be the population of the bin that they came out of. So I think I had just sort of this rough idea of maybe 1,200 worms being the starting point, and then we just simply took 1/3 of them. So I've just been going on the assumption that this system here was launched with a quantity of about 400 or so worms. How accurate that is, I have no idea. And how important it is to know how many worms you have is not that important either. But obviously the more worms you have, the more active your bin is going to be, and the greater capability it's going to have to break down materials. Alright, I think things look really nice in here, and once again, I had come in here a couple times previously to make sure that this top covering of paper was nice and damp. And it was only because it was a freshly built bin, and I knew I would be not checking in on it for a few days, so I just wanted to make sure from a moisture perspective everything was good. But once again, since I prefer to try to manage the moisture in my systems just by throttling dry and damp foods, I'm going to stick to that until such a time that I really feel like I need to bring in actual water to make adjustments to the moisture. So, popping the camera off its clip here, so let's get clipped onto the other container after we get that one labeled and feed bin number 2. So now down here in bin number 2, you might remember there was this piece of cardboard that had this rough scribble on it that almost looks like a number 2, so that's kind of apropos. Oops, some leaves falling off my camera. But you know what, before we get to feeding, let's make sure we've covered up. Well, it's not all about covering up the label that the manufacturer put on the container. It's more about putting on the label that we made to indicate what kind of worms we've got in here and how old it is, and even a distinction of bin 1 versus bin 2 and 3. So in this case, the distinction of bin 2, so as to not confuse it with bins 1 and 3. Alright, so I'm going to get this thing clipped back on. Let's see how it looks. A little bit awkward, I must say, but we'll figure something out. This is all initial testing. I've not attempted to film in these types of containers before, and it's definitely unusual for me because I'm used to much shallower containers. The paper here feels a lot like the paper in the other one did, and I assume that's going to be more or less what we encounter in each system. I always do my best to do things in a consistent way in systems like this that have similar ages and similar setups and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of value in maintaining systems kind of concurrently with one another. It almost seems like, especially in a case like this, if you got 3 almost identical systems, and then if one of the 3 starts doing something unusual that the other 2 aren't doing, then, you know, it might indicate something peculiar going wrong in that particular system, since it's not keeping pace, or, you know, who knows, maybe it goes the other direction. Maybe it's just suddenly taking off and getting much more active or productive than your other systems, and maybe it's hiding some sort of a secret that you want to reveal, so you can share that productivity and increase in system efficiency with all your systems. So here's some couple worms hanging out on our number 2 label. I wonder how long it's going to take before those things start to fade so much that we can't read them anymore, or that we can't even tell that it was our original little starting slip of paper. It'll be kind of interesting to watch it break down, but right now it doesn't really show any signs of wear. So I'm trying to portion out this little container that I have with this shredded paper in it. I want to make sure I leave enough for all 3 systems. So I just dumped a pretty good amount in right there. Might have maybe a little bit left that we could still throw in here, but I think I'm gonna have to save some for the other system. Now here we've got what remains of the coffee, which, like I did in the other system, I think might benefit from being sort of spread around a little bit and mixed in with some of the materials surrounding it. And you know what? I can go really nitpicky on this and try to be really fair and say, hey, you know, we gotta, if you're giving a coffee filter to one system, you gotta give it to all 3. Well, no, I'm really not gonna get that nitpicky on this. I just figure maybe if we don't give them as much shredded paper, the white paper, then maybe we can just compensate a little bit by giving them some paper that I shredded by hand for them. And now we can consider each one as receiving an equal amount of shredded paper. Now let me grab a nice handful of food and spread that in here. I'm going to try to size up how much remains in the bag. It does seem like I've gone maybe a little bit light on the first container. I guess I'll have to get a little bit better at portioning this stuff out evenly for these little guys. But it's not a race. I can't even say for sure that each system has an equal number of worms in it, so who knows. We'll see where things lead. We'll be able to gauge performance based on how much throughput the system has in terms of its capability to break down materials. So let's just throw in a little bit more bedding here, and I think we'll top off with leaves only, but I wanted to drop in a little bit of this coffee out of filter number 2. Oops, well, maybe not quite that much, but that's fine. Here again, I've got to tip things, and I gotta put things diagonal to slide past the camera so I'm not bumping into it. Here again, the camera's covered in scraps of shredded paper. Slightly awkward. Maybe I would have been better off just using the tripod to hold the camera. I might have to try it that way next time. Kind of have the tripod, allowing the camera to peek in from the side rather than having the camera almost directly above the surface of the material in the bin. Alright, you know what? I can't resist. I know I'm putting some more leaves on, so I wanted to just throw in a little bit more veggie matter right there on top, and then we'll cover it with a nice portion of leaves. It did seem like maybe the first system got the greatest amount of paper. Maybe this one can be considered as having received the greatest amount of leaves so far. But we'll have to see how it goes in container number 3 once we get there. Alright. Things are so awkward. I feel like I could do the maintenance of my regular bus bin systems in my sleep with my eyes closed and with a arm tied behind my back, maybe even blindfolded. But you get the idea. I think that filming here within these buckets is a little bit awkward, to say the least. Whatever. Hopefully it ends up in a good video. Let's get the next container out here. It looks like besides being awkward, it's also messy. Half of the stuff ends up in the bin and the other half ends up out here on the table. Yay. Before we get to feeding, we want to attach the sticker. And now it's into the bin. Well, to save me the trouble of needing to avoid wires and power cables, I'm running off the battery of the camera. And when we finished feeding bin number 1, it already said that I had used up half the energy of the battery, and right now it's telling me that I've still got a third, so hopefully we've got enough to get this done, but I'm going to see what I could do about not dawdling. This is a mango seed. It's the outer husk, I guess, because the seed that's usually inside doesn't seem to be there. Maybe there's little fragments of it or something, but That, as well as these banana peel bits, all came over from the last bin. Here we can see a couple worms hanging out and working on that stuff. I guess we could take another little quick peek through this system like we did in the others, just to get a sense of how things are looking in here. See if we could spot some worms. Maybe we even take a quick peek on these outer edges. Yeah, things look pretty nice over there. A couple worms hanging out. Once again, the dampness, moisture level in this system feels pretty good. I'm also kind of glad to, go down a little bit deeper into these fresh bits of bedding that were laid into the bucket before the worms and the material that they were inhabiting was placed in here with the food that they were working on. So the worms have obviously made themselves at home and have moved into the fresh bedding. Sometimes I feel like the aged pre-made bedding has kind of had a chance to soak and prime, sort of. Might be a little bit more hospitable, but luckily it doesn't take long for the worms to find some material and end up calling it their own. Even all the way at the bottom, which is not an uncommon place to find worms. A lot of times moisture just ends up down there and they go down there for the moisture. But over here too, yeah. I wonder if any of these bins are going to start to emerge as possibly one that's got more worms in it than the others or something. I don't know. It'll be curious to see how they perform. Assuming we can manage to keep giving them somewhat consistent feedings of equal quantities. So for a little change of pace, I'm going to come in here now with a little bit of leaves with which to lay down the foundation for our feeding. And we'll save the paper for upper level. And now the plastic that's got the food in it, I think I'm simply going to upturn it rather than run the risk of getting any of this gooey, thawed out vegetable matter all over my camera. Hopefully I can do it in a way that any sort of potential issues are averted. That's a pretty good amount of food. Probably comparable to what the last bin received. Perhaps the first system was a little bit deprived of food. I don't know if that first system got quite as much as these other two did. And don't forget, we've also got what remains of this coffee in this filter. And here too, we're just going to put this filter to good use as supplemental bedding to go in there, along with the additional shredded paper that I'm going to drop in on top. But you know what, let me first see if I can mix some of this coffee into the veggies down below it. That's got to help the stuff get broken down more quickly. If it's soaked in carrot juices and other veggie juices. Although a certain amount of the moisture that did come out of these veggie scraps was sort of lost, because I just allowed that stuff to sort of drip out of the bag. I put some puncture holes in the bag, and then I allowed that stuff to simply go down the drain. There wasn't a great deal of it, but if we had placed frozen foods in here, then all those drippings would have ended up down here in the bin. So usually I'll feed with frozen stuff, but in a way I felt like in a little cramped system like this, unless I can feed in such a way that I can really limit the amount of the frozen material exposing itself to worms and, possibly causing a little bit of freezer burn or freezer burn is for foods, right? I'm thinking frostbite. Then again, who knows? I don't think worms get frostbite, do they? I don't know. But I just figured if I can avoid placing frozen foods up against the little guys, then why not just take that extra step and allow the foods to thaw out prior to putting them into the bins. And, maybe we put a little bit less of a strain on the little wormies. But that's pretty much it. I've still got a few things that I got to clean up, such as the camera. Shake off all the little scraps of bedding that are sticking to it. And I got a couple things I've got to put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for tolerating my unusual situation here with these little tiny containers. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.